Tuna gonna be giving your lecture today. He's on my stool. He can do it. He knows everything about Delores Williams. He does. He's so happy to be doing this. What do you have to say, Tuna? He loves all this attention he's getting. Next time, he'll tell you everything you need to know. Every single thing. Let me fix this. Okay. I'm doing my best with this. Alright, so this video is all about Delores Williams, who we covered some before the break but didn't really cover that well, so I just want to say a few words about her. Her book, Sisters in the Wilderness, we read about a chapter and the introduction from it, but in what I'm about to say, I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a broader overview so that you know some of the stuff that goes on throughout the rest of the book. So, main thing in this book is that Williams proposes a connection between the biblical figure Hagar, I'm just going to say Hagar, if that's alright, and African American women. So for Williams, quote, Hagar and many African American women are sisters in the wilderness, struggling for life, and by the help of God, coming to terms with situations that have destructive potential. Williams frames African American use of biblical texts about Hagar as a key example of the survival quality of life tradition of African American biblical appropriation. It's all his hair. Tuna's hair. So she sets the survival quality of life tradition in tension with what she calls the liberation tradition of African American biblical appropriation. He just bit me on the arm. He bit me on the leg. He wants my attention. And okay, so Williams draws a contrast between the survival quality of life tradition of biblical appropriation centered on Hagar and the liberation tradition of African American biblical appropriation, which is centered on the Exodus from Egypt. The Williams associates this liberation tradition more with black male theologians like James Cone and Martin Luther King Jr. You remember how Martin Luther King Jr. he drew like connections between himself and Moses, like Moses leading the Israelites through the wilderness after the Exodus. So Williams, she's setting out to distinguish her own ethical principle of survival and a positive quality of life for black women and their families from James Cone's ethical principle centered around the Exodus story of liberation by any means necessary. By any means necessary. Yeah. So Williams considers the survival quality of life tradition to be a useful route to grappling with the struggles that African American women face today in a hostile world. She draws a number of parallels. First, between Hagar's experiences as a surrogate for her abusive mistress, Sarah, like literally a surrogate mother bearing Sarah's child, and African American women's struggles to survive through various forms of coerced surrogacy in the midst of a society that has genocidal intentions. So Williams explains that African American women in the pre-war period, the antebellum period, served as surrogates for the white mistress of the house in their role as mammy figures taking care of the white children, and then surrogates for black and white men in their roles as field workers, and then surrogates again for white wives to white men in their roles as the victims of sexual assault by white men. In the post-bellum period, after the Civil War, African American women continued to be sexually harassed by white men, of course, to this day, being, again, surrogates for white men's wives, and they also continue to do a great deal of hard labor. Besides surrogacy, another key concept that Williams uses to parallel the experiences of Hagar and African American women is the wilderness. The wilderness. So as in the case of surrogacy, Williams distinguishes between African American pre-war and post-war experiences of the wilderness. In the antebellum South, the wilderness was envisioned as a free and friendly space where you could isolate yourself. You could meet Jesus in the wilderness, be healed by Jesus in the wilderness, and become transformed with new strength, new vision. That kind of sentiment, pre-war sentiment, is why I assigned that song to you, the Go in the Wilderness song. It says, if you want to find Jesus, go in the wilderness, and so on. That song kind of captures this sentiment that you can go out into the wilderness and be like isolated and just by yourself and free and meet Jesus there. In the post-bellum world, after the war, African Americans retained a positive sense of the wilderness as a place where you can meet Jesus, but coupled with this was a sense that African Americans had been like thrown abroad, like cast abroad upon the waves of an inhospitable world. They were freed, but I'm sure as many of you know, in unbelievable new struggles began, including just figuring out what to do economically, how to survive, how to live, and then of course later on the lynching atrocity. In post-bellum life, as the actual wilderness receded, the wilderness increasingly became a location in one's mind where you could kind of corral yourself, engage in intensive prayer and fasting, and receive communication and strength from God. So just as Hagar met God in the wilderness and was sustained by God in the wilderness, black women can meet God I suppose today through a kind of meditative isolation and trial in their own minds, but I don't think it has to be purely mental, because there are many circumstances, like everyday circumstances, where you can be sustained. It's a wilderness out there. It's a wilderness out there. Lots of opportunities to be sustained in your life. So, in addition to recovering this survival quality of life tradition that's centered around Hagar, another key goal of Williams's project is an identification of points of difference and points of concurrence in dialogue with black male liberationist theologies. Williams dialogues with black liberationist theologians in 3 areas: theological method, and that includes their approach to the Bible, human experience, the theological task. And then the 2 other areas are doctrine and ethics. In regard to theological method, Williams contends, in contrast to James Cone, that the Bible is not unambiguously liberative. Which I think is importantly true based on the conversations we had about feminist theology when we read Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. So Williams says that the Bible isn't unambiguously liberative, and interpretations of the Bible that are unambiguously liberative and exalting in particular the Exodus narrative ignore the non-Hebrew victims. Like the people, I think about, Williams uses as an example, like the Canaanites and other peoples who were in the land that the Israelites hoped to claim for their own. And at least according to the Hebrew Bible, and there's some question as to the historicity of this, but Israelites committed genocide against many other peoples to clear out that land. And Williams compares these non-Hebrew victims to black women in that, I mean, if you think about it, if black men like Martin Luther King and James Cone were thinking about themselves as kind of leading this exodus of freedom, but then on the way to this freedom, a lot of other people suffered, a lot of other people were victims. I guess you could include black women in that category. Because they were victims of sexism at the hands of black men. So Williams, she also contends that the black experience, again in contrast with black liberationist theologies, must be reformulated as a common wilderness experience that recognizes the historical agency of Hagar-like women and families, as well as black men. Like, black experience isn't just black male experience. That's what she's trying to say. You need to have a more realistic, nuanced approach to black experience. And then in regard to doctrine, Williams critiques black male theologians' uncomplicated acceptance of the Jesus as surrogate motif. Jesus bore the brunt of our sins, so we didn't have to. Jesus stood in our place. That's a surrogate motif. So she's critiquing black male theologians just uncritically adopting this because she feels that it's had destructive consequences for black women. Like, black women might be told, be like Jesus, stand in for whoever and that leads to their suffering. And it can make black women believe that their suffering is like God ordained or redemptive, which is no good. And finally, in regard to ethics, Williams hopes to supplement the typically black male liberation ethic, of course, like I said, with the survival quality of life ethic more resonant with black women's concerns. In every case, what Williams is doing is trying to expand knowledge of the character of black people's existence by introducing black women's experience into the conversation. She's attempting to facilitate an epistemological expansion, you could say, an expansion of knowing, an expansion of knowledge through the integration of black women's experiences into theological discussions. Now, Williams' book was written in the 1990s, and it was like new and like vigorously challenging and important, and it's still important now, but like her, I mean, there are some points where you could critique her, like, for example, in her like, fairly uncritical use of categories like black women's experience. She kind of falls into the same trap as white feminists did. Like, white feminists said they were speaking for all of women's experience when they were really only speaking from, like, white upper class women's experience. I mean, there's always a danger when you try to create a broad category of experience. There's just, there's a lot of tremendous diversity even within the category of black women's experience. And, I mean, the homogenous category that she creates of black women's experience, I mean, it excludes, like, for example, queer black women, and it's pretty clear, based on Williams's consistent emphasis on black female motherhood and family, that she's thinking of, like, heterosexual black women when she's writing. And then, on a positive note, like, one element of the book that I think I'll always remember from when I read it several years ago is the historical accounts that Williams provides about the lives of female slaves. And I'm going to remember this particular notice posted by a slave owner for quite a while. And this slave owner was trying to get his female slave, like, caught again and returned. And the slave owner clearly had his hands full, because he or she says, I guess he, quote, "Sarah is the biggest devil that ever lived, having poisoned the stud horse and set a table on fire. Also burnt General R. Williams' stable and stockyard with 7 horses and other property to the value of $1,500. She was handcuffed and got away at Ruddle's Mills on her way down the river, which is the 5th time she escaped when about to be sent out of the country." I don't know, I just think that's kind of badass. And one time I heard another talk by Larisha Hawkins, who we saw speak a few weeks ago. But I saw her give another talk, and she said that, like, in the midst of injustice, it's necessary to think and act, well, not act exactly, but take action like a gangster. Think like a gangster. Which means, she meant that you have to anticipate the strategies of your oppressor and respond. Like, powerfully, subversively. And I mean, I just think that setting a bunch of stuff on fire and escaping for the 5th time and all of this is it's pretty gangster. So black women's historical strategies of resistance, they continue to be instructive for scholarly reflection and actual praxis today in response to the perpetuation of structures of systemic racism and violence against people of color. There are a lot of different strategies of resistance. And one final element of Williams's work that's striking me personally, and I mean, I've really carried it with me, like it's a huge part of my dissertation. That's why, my dissertation is called, second part of it is a neurodivergent theology of liberation and survival. Well, it's really striking me that Williams emphasizes survival instead of liberation. I mean, it's absolutely an effort to distinguish yourself from the black male liberationist thinkers and their strategies and carve out some distinctive strategies of her own. However, Williams's emphasis on survival, it's also a practical recognition of the relative precariousness and fragility of black female life. So having to contend with violence from white men, white women, and black men on all sides. And her emphasis on survival also recognizes the greater degree of care and strategic resistance that black women were required to exercise to even continue to exist. So in context of extreme injustice, the goal of survival, pragmatically speaking, comes to replace the goal of total liberation. The goal of survival captures much more vividly the careful navigating that the secondarily marginalized must carry out. By secondarily marginalized, I mean like they have multiple marginalized identities. So there's a great deal of careful social navigating that secondarily marginalized need to carry out as outsiders to this unjust system, who at the same time live within it. And I mean, I think that Williams's claims are still very useful in analyzing the experiences of other secondarily marginalized people. So I hope that you'll keep this stuff in mind, that you'll keep Williams's appropriation of the Haggard text and her emphasis on survival in mind, because we're going to be seeing responses to those two tropes, especially when we're studying disability theology and Latinx theologies. This Sisters in the Wilderness was and continues to be an incredibly influential book that, I mean, like I said, I got a tuna hair in my mouth. Like I said, has spread its influence to all these other theologies of liberation, like disability and Latinx theologies. Well, thank you. Hope that was somewhat helpful.